Hello and welcome to my YouTube channel. My name is Alexey and today I have a special guest, Charlie Bauerfeind. Charlie Bauerfeind is a sound engineer and a record producer who has been working with such great metal bands as Angra, Blind Guardian, Helloween, Primal Fear, Rage, Saxon, HammerFall, and many more. In our today's interview, we're going to be talking about Charlie Bauerfeind's work on the latest album of Helloween, which is called Giants and Monsters. It's a huge honor to have you on my YouTube channel today, Mr. Bauerfeind. And let's start our interview. How you became a sound engineer?
How I became a sound engineer? Well, actually, I didn't want to become one. I was like, I wanted to become a drummer. I played drums in various bands around my area where I grew up. And when I was 10, I started to play drums. When I was 5 or so, I started piano. So I had some musical lessons. And then I just played in bands. And they never wanted to work as hard as I wanted to work. So it was always like when we had rehearsals, they were like, no. The girlfriend of my girlfriend's girlfriend has a birthday party, so I'm not coming and stuff. So I, decided I want to, try it on for myself to be like just a session drummer or whatever. So I actually applied for Berklee College of Music in Boston, and I got in, and I went over there and started, being a drummer, but you also taught like all sorts of, harmony, ear training and all the classes we had. And one class was like, music production engineering, like, just to look into it. And I always had we didn't have the money to actually hire a proper engineer when we did our demos with my band. But we only had like 4-track cassette players at that time. It was in the 80s. So it was like really basic. But, I was always a little bit interested in it. Let me put it like this. And then there's only like 2 majors at Berklee where you actually have to do an entry test. Not because they are so great, but because they are, they only could handle at that time like 200, 210 students. So there was a limit, how many people could enter. And, it was kind of sports to actually try to take the entry test for music production engineering. And I went there as well, and I actually got accepted. And most of the students that did it, they dropped out very early because they couldn't handle the mathematics and the physics and that stuff. And I was always better in, having numbers around me, like in physics and math. Than, with, for example, languages. It was always hard for me to learn a language, but numbers were not that hard. So I actually got, in there, and I was like, in the beginning, it was quite hard, but I, managed to stay in there. And because I wasn't that great in English at that time, so I had to, do a lot of extra work actually to understand what they even wanted from me. And and then that's just, it actually just took off. I was in the program, and then they have like this, you have classes, you start off with 8-track recording, and then like 8-track mixdown, 8-track recording, 24-track mixdown, and 24-track recording. And these are all classes that build on each other. So when you have like 24-track recording at the very end of your studying, you were eligible to sign up what was called recording ensembles. These were like the best musicians of the school, and the best in pop and blah blah blah. They were like building recording ensembles, and you went there like once a week and recorded for like 2 hours, and then you had another 2-hour mix session. But like I said, you were only eligible when you had these 24-track classes. And one semester I was there, and they didn't have enough engineers. And they were actually asking me, because I always hang out there and, try to make friends with the people there, with all the students and stuff. So I was like, they asked me, have you ever recorded a 24-track a recording session? And I went like, yeah, of course. Of course I hadn't. I skipped the number 2 in the beginning. I had done 4 track, but not 24. So it was like, I just jumped in and it turned out to be a really, really demanding session, because it was like the Lenny Peterson Back Bay Brass Ensemble. So they played pop music, but they had like 10 brass section, like the saxophone, trombone, trumpets and all that stuff, and drums, keyboards, piano, guitar, background vocals, and all needed to be recorded in one room. When you entered, there was nothing. There was like everything at 0, and you had 2 hours to record a song. So in the beginning, I was like really, having a hard time doing this, but it actually turned out quite well, and I got, very fast into trying out things. I parallel gated some room microphones for the drums and was just playing around with stuff. And they really liked it. Like the Lenny Peterson, who was the teacher and the head of the ensemble, he really liked my work. And like even in the next semester, when he asked me if I would like to stay and do his recording ensemble the next semester as well, which I was also not eligible to do. And, so they actually told him, no, I can't, because I'm not in the right class. So he went like, well, he wants me, and he pushed for it. So I, finally also did this ensemble again. And then I started doing some assistant work in Boston, in a studio called Downtown Recorders. That's where like Aerosmith, they recorded some demos there, and it was pretty old, but a nice analog studio with 24 tracks and stuff. And while I was there, we did like the Pixies album, The Doolittle, which is like one of the major underground kind of punk pop records in the US. So that was really lucky, and I was doing a lot of stuff, and a teacher of mine, he kind of, supported me. He asked me to go out and record some, actually a CBS jazz artist called Full Circle at that time, because there were some, also of course, Dream Theater. All these guys, they were Berklee students as well. They graduated when I started. I started in 87. And they were done in 87. This was, Dream Theater was one of the school bands, and this Full Circle guys, they were mainly from Sweden and some from America. They were also like, highly successful in their field. And so I went down to New York for the mix session, and we went out to Blue Jay in Carlisle, Massachusetts, which is one of the major, jazz and fusion recording studios at that time. So that was really helped. And then I had to come back because, it's quite expensive in the US. Back then it was, and still probably is. So, we came back and we moved down to Munich. And Munich is like, because they had the most studios, but it didn't mean anything because you couldn't get any jobs. They would not take, I wanted to become an assistant engineer. And they, it was not possible. I mean, there were some really nice studios. There was the Musicland studios from Mac Thelmer. He used to do the Queen and stuff, and Billy Squier and Deep Purple in his studio. So that was one of the studios where I would really have loved to, get into as an assistant engineer, but it wasn't possible. And then I just stayed there and in Munich and tried to find a job. And finally, like after 6 months or 9 months even, looking around for jobs, I got the chance to do what they call a shootout mix. They basically called me up. I just went around and had this sheet of paper saying, I can do this and this and this. And if you need help, to clean the toilet, call me. And I was, I was ready to do anything. And I went and did that. And they actually called me up and said, look, we have this song to mix. Would you like to try a shootout mix? And I said, yeah, of course. So I went down the next day and I had like 6 hours for a 48 track production. It was a rock band. They were called Caro. They were signed to Teldec at that time. But they had some, minor success. They were quite known, and they had recorded a new record. And so I did this one song. They gave me one song to mix, and I did that. And from ever since, was working in this field because they really liked what I was doing. So I had to mix their album, and then I just went on and did, all sorts of stuff down there, which was mostly more oriented in the pop stuff. And, not so much rock, but we had this studio I was working in. They had a guy trying to get jobs for the studio, and they actually approached SPV and were in touch with Sieges Even, a band. They were located in Munich, and at that time they were like this was like the jazz band of the metal fans. I mean, they didn't sell that many records, but everybody knew it, and it was kind of a and classic kind of, even more than Rush or Watchtower and these kind of bands, really, really progressive. So I did one record with them, Steps it was called back then, and I did another record with them in Munich, and then the SPV, asked me if I would like to come to Hanover, and that's when I, went to Hanover, and there I was working in a studio called Horus Sound. And like the Scorpions were recording there, and Kai Hansen and all this. And that's when I got in touch, with Heaven's Gate and, and the old management from Helloween with Lim Schnorr, because he was managing Heaven's Gate. So that then was kind of my start. I started out then doing metal. Before I have to admit, I was not that much of a metalhead. Like in when I, played music myself, I was more into like the, Brit rock, Brit punk kind of scene, more punky, but not like double bass drum, playing, And that was really interesting to get in there, because I remember I told, Sakis the other day that the singer from Heaven's Gate, Friedel, he came up to me and he said, I want to have a vocal sound like Rob Halford. And I went like, yeah, no problem. And I went like, who is Rob Halford? I even told him like 10 years later when I met him in LA, when we worked on some stuff. So, that this was the case, because at that time there was no internet. You couldn't go, Rob Halford, singer of Judas Priest. I went across the street, was like a newspaper thing, and they had Rock Hard magazine. So, I found out who Rob Halford was, and that's how I got started there.
How you got into recording and mixing metal?
This was actually exactly the entrance, like with Heaven's Gate. It's, a horror sound. This was like, it's like, I don't know how it is in Russia, but in Germany, it's kind of, we have like the pop city, which is Munich, which is very much like Leitschlager, pop stuff. Then you have Cologne, which is like the German rock, with German kind of lyrics and stuff. And then you had like Hamburg and Hanover. Hanover, the more you got north, the harder it became. So Hamburg was kind of, of course, home of Helloween and, Kai Hansen and stuff, and Gamma Ray. And, so when I started in Hanover, I think the first thing I did was Glenmore. I don't know if you know that band. They used to be signed to Warner Brothers at that time, from Hanover, nice band. And I was working with Thunderhead, like a rock band. And then I was working with Victory. And people just seemed to like what I was doing. And then, I got some calls and, they were asking me to, can you do this? Can you do that? And I was like, okay. So I was just constantly in the studio. At some point, I was really close to being burned out because, we were young. I mean, I was like late 20s, 28, 29. And I was like just going 22 hours a day, 2 hours sleep, 22 hours a day. And it's, it takes its tolls. But yeah, it was really nice. And I basically got into it because, people liked, I mean, there was like the Heaven's Gate was like the first more or less real metal record, because Sieges Even I always think was a little bit more, like fusion-y and like Rush, like, like I said, progressive thing. So the first one was Heaven's Gate, and then because Limp was also doing Angra from Brazil. So I got in touch with Angra and Andre Matos' band, and his old band was called Viper. So I did like one Viper record, and then I went on and did some records with Angra, the Angel's Cry and the Holy Land stuff. And that also, I at that time I also got asked to work with Running Wild. And Running Wild was actually like when we were done with this record, it's a very unique album. I was always trying to do some very how can I say this, different than anybody else. I never wanted to sound like anybody, or was listening, it have to sound like the old Helloween stuff or whatever. So I was just experimenting a lot. And with Running Wild, it was really kind of this, he was on the same kind of path, Rock and Rolf, because he came in for the mixes, and we mixed the whole record on headphones. And I mean, we had at that time, we had like a really nice studio with like, huge speakers, and everything was right there at Horizon. It was a really great studio to mix albums there. But it was like, he wanted to do everything on headphones, because he said, well, I was a fan and I wasn't allowed to listen to music loud at home. So I always listened on headphones. So I can, easily tell you if it sounds great on headphones, but not on any big speakers. So we mixed this whole album on headphones, and it has a very, mid-rangey kind of sound. It wasn't scooped. It has a lot of character. And it was really, came out really, really nice. And actually, that's what Kai told me. He went out one evening, and he went we had this Rock Fabrik thing going on in the 80s and 90s, which were like rock discotheques, and they played metal. And he was there and then they played everything like, Pink Room 69, Helloween, Gamma Ray. And then, there came, Running Wild, a Black Hand In. And he said that the sounded so different because it has all these mid frequencies. And then when you add like the big speakers from the discotheque, like, the low end and the high end to it, it sounded fantastic. And he said it sounded better than anything else. And he said, who did this? And then, so, he called me up, and then we started talking, and then we did the Insanity and Genius together. And then we got together again for Land of the Free. And in between I did Angra, and then I was just constantly doing metal stuff. And I was really lucky to work with some of the bands at a time where they were, really, really inventive. Let me put it like this. They were like Helloween was that already in the 80s, but it got more and more into trying to be commercial or successful kind of vein. Back then, I mean, when I listen now to like Land of the Free or even Insanity and Genius, I mean, it's full with like gimmicks, and we did. I was telling Sakis because we had it about guitar amplifiers and guitar speakers. We recorded the rhythm guitars in the toilet. We put the cap in the toilet because it created a sound, and that's what we were after. We were after like, this sounds great. And he had this BB gun pistol that it did like noises from Star Trek, this weird stuff. So he just put it like Eddie Van Halen with his, with the drilling machine. He just put it to the pickup and went. If you put that on the record, it was just. We just had fun. It was just really a great time to be around and do some, and we didn't give a fuck, so to speak, about, about the record companies. I mean, we said, hey, this is it, and that spirit I got told later on was already around when Helloween did like the Keepers albums. Because they were like, the record company was saying, no, this is way too much. We have to do it like this and this. And they just went, fuck it. And I was the same. I remember with Angra, when we did the mix, because I had done Land of the Free, and the Japanese record company sent me a mail and said, yeah, it's quite okay when we send in the first mixes. And they would say, yeah, it's quite okay, but the Japanese kids love the sound of bass drum. That's why the bass drum has to sound like in the Gamma Ray album. And I did this Gamma Ray album, so I knew exactly how to do it. But I was always, talking with Andre because he had this very high falsetto kind of voice, very delicate. And, so I said, look, this is the edge. This is what gives us the borderline of aggressiveness. If you get too aggressive, you would ruin his performance. And that was what was the thing. So we had our concept for that. So we also said, hey, fuck it. We do whatever we want. And lucky enough, I think they expected something like 50,000 records being sold in Japan. But we went 2 weeks or so, we went gold. We had 120,000. So we were right. Even so, we were the stupid kids, but we were right. And that was just a great time. So a lot of what I call my iconic kind of work, the Gamma Ray album and stuff, and the Black Hand In album and stuff, that just happened because it was the right time, being at the right place at the right time. And that was just a great thing. And then it just went on. And, of course, then having worked with Gamma Ray, then I got approached by actually Michael Kiske. I worked on his solo albums. So I already had worked with everybody before I even started working with Helloween in 2000, which was then of course Blind Guardian was in between and stuff. So it just went ballistic for a couple of years, and I was just working. I have to say that, if you want to be in this industry, you have to give it a 200%. It's not something for now doing it a little bit. And I think it still is. You can, if you work hard and if you have a little bit of talent, you can make it there. If you really be passionate, it's all about passion. It's not about technique and this and that. This helps you, but I'm still I'm baffled with the at the MetalCon last year. We had this discussion about cleaning out vocals, taking away breath, and then now they have this AI kind of plugins that just clean up your vocals, and I go that's bullshit. For metal, I'm not saying that it's bullshit in general, but I say in metal, I want the opposite. I want to have I had worked with Rob Halford, and when Rob sings, there is no, 10,000 euro microphone and blah, blah, blah. It's a fucking SM58 or a SMB7 from, and he just grabs it and he goes, it just gives it this full power, and you have to capture it. And then you figure out what to do with it. And when I first saw his vocal chains, there was EQ compressor de-esser, EQ compressor de-esser, EQ compressor de-esser, 3-4 setups, one after each other, just for different frequencies to get this worked out. And it was fantastic. And that's what, stuck in my mind. And I always, want to give character and breathing and all the little noises in between from singers. That's what makes it great. That's what makes it emotional. Cleaning it out. I don't know how people do it nowadays, but it sounds very, we always were talking about the shuffle of dirt. And we actually worked really hard to get a nice shuffle of dirt into our recordings. We didn't want to sound clean. We wanted to sound, rough and furious and mayhem and whatever, but it all changed.
How you started working with Helloween?
Like I said, because I was already working with everybody on its own, I got approached by actually I got told later on that Roland and also Vicky and stuff, I have done the Saxon album Metalhead, which was when they turned, when they kind of split up in 98, Saxon, and went different ways, a part of the band, and, Biff, the singer, and he wanted to take a more metal direction. So I had done a record called Metalhead. And that got kind of popular with a lot of musicians because they really liked it. And actually Roland and also Mikey and stuff, they heard it and they said, "Oh, who's done that?" And, so this is how they approached me. Actually, the management called me and then they were saying, would you like to work with Helloween? And I said, yeah, of course. And, they said, we're going to fly you down to Tenerife, where Andi Deris has his studio. And of course, I've seen all of them around in Hamburg, and they didn't know me, but I knew them, of course. And I knew, of course, Kai and Michi and stuff. But at that time, they both were not in the band, obviously. So they flew me down, and then we were actually having I had a day with Helloween, like, we sit together and, did some talking about music and stuff. And then on the next day, because I didn't know that, and he didn't know of me, Roy Z, he was also on Tenerife. They flew him in. So on the next day, Roy had like a day with the band, and was talking and stuff. And, the band wasn't really, they weren't like really leaning into any direction, nor me or Roy and stuff. And they were saying, actually, you're both great. And, and then we kind of had the idea, then why don't we do it together? Because it's a complex band. It's, it's quite a lot of work to do. And so that was the decision then. And that's how the first, the Dark Ride actually was done. When with Roy we flew down. I mean, that was a kind of test. We didn't know if the drums would work in Andy's studio because it's quite small. But it turned out to be really, really nice. And it worked out great. But we did like a drum session with Uli down at Tenerife, and then we jumped into the production. And Roy, of course, he's a great songwriter, and, has worked with Dickinson on the Chemical Wedding stuff. And so, he went in and did some songwriting with them in Hamburg. And then we all met on Tenerife and, pulled through the production of Dark Ride. And I'm stuck there ever since. I mean, then, we just it was a little bit of a weird thing because there was a lot of involvement of record company and also like, management companies. There's like, I didn't really knew that at that time. For me, it was, I was also always, more on the side of the artist. I mean, the artist and what the artist thinks, that's the things that drive me. And then bringing in the ideas of a record company and stuff. I don't know, sometimes they just have great ideas and sometimes they just have stupid ideas. Let me put it like this. And, so I was always very careful on that side. And I remember, I think because of Roy being there, they were like all into, we're going to bring out the record in America. And I remember they had the American single, picked, which was If I Could Fly. It was picked actually for the American market. And the record company and management was, great. So we're going to push that. The stupid thing is the record never came out in US. It only came out in Europe and Japan and stuff and South America. But I think it was never really released. It was released later on, but not when it came out. So this was all kind of weird stuff going on because we had, with bands like that, we were recording a lot of songs. This happens all the time. Like, when you do productions on that level, you're not going in when you have 12 songs. They've written 15, 16, 18, 20, 22 songs. And then you start, putting them together, and then you start doing pre-production, and then they go into the rehearsal room and so mostly we started out with like 16, 18 songs recording drums because that comes first. And then sometimes you already drop songs because you feel, okay, this one is not quite ready or doesn't feel right after the drum recordings and blah, blah, blah. So we always cut down. But also for Dark Ride, we had like I think 15 or 16 songs all in all. And, it was very much aimed onto the American market, but with all the 16 songs considering, because there were some great songs of Marcus, bass player, and he doesn't think about America or anything. He just writes fun songs and stuff. So it was kind of, it could have aimed a little bit more into the European market for my taste, but that was kind of the thing. And that's what also I think the band felt, when we continued with the Rabbit album and all that stuff later on. So that's why probably I stayed, and, Roy wasn't involved that much anymore, because he was more for the American way of thinking, a lot of down-tuned stuff. And it's nice, but, it's not, you can do a couple of songs, on some of the records we have done some, dark sounding stuff. But, Helloween, I mean, they are all like, more like in the bright, positive kind of thinking. I think that's what appeals to a lot of kids, because they feel they want to save the world, even so, the keeper is like a fantasy figure and stuff. But for them, it's not so, everybody is dead and war and blah, blah, blah. That's not their world. I mean, they're really more into the cheering you up thing, and, pointing out, ooh, this is not good, watch the other way or whatever. So, and that's really, really cool. And that was always also my thing. Even so, I have worked with some dark bands. I once worked with Venom on albums and stuff. So I'm this yin-yang kind of person. So, I have to experience some of that stuff and some of the other stuff to value some of the other stuff. The other side. So it's like, for me, it was really good, because right after I did like, I think it was 3 albums with Michael. And Michael Kiske at that time, he was highly into the anthroposophy thing, the Rudolf Steiner, and, very, very, very bright and very focused kind of records into the positive thinking way. And then, like a month later, I was recording Venom, the completely other side of music. But that was really interesting, and that's how I got up with them, and I'm really happy. I mean, they are. I think we have a very good understanding on what the band wants and what the band needs. And, even later on, when they changed the management company, when, John has a lot of input creative wise, also like in the, how the stage presentation is and stuff. And so they are very much involved, but they're more European thinking, That's what it is.
How were drums recorded for Giants and Monsters album by Helloween?
I have done a sample library, like over when the pandemic, hit. We were like really limited on going out. There were no concerts. Even so, I was involved in the Wacken, the digital thing they did, like streaming and, patching it all up in a TV studio and stuff during the pandemic. But, so we did quite some, drum samples, which actually came out, with Agritone on the Klangmacht. And so we went to the same studio, because me and Danny, we already had, worked in the studio before. Actually, I think that it was even the very first thing we've done was in 2018 when they did the Pumpkins United song. We were there already and recording there. So, and it, the studio is just really nice. And then we just basically went in, and we normally take a lot of time. Because first of all, it's a very demanding thing. I really want to have like energy. For me, energy is the most important thing for drums. I once worked with Mickey D from Motorhead and stuff. So it's, I know how energy, has to has to sound like, so to speak. And we are really always looking for exactly that. So we take quite some time and we put on like new heads for every song. We change the complete drum heads on every tom and on the snare and stuff. So we take normally like, I don't know how many days were planned. I think we had 30 days planned, and we took the 30 days. But we experimented. We had like 3 or 4 different drum kits. So different songs got different treatments, we had like a 28-inch bass drum and stuff. So it's really was very varied this time. And we took quite some care, and we did a lot of different versions. Because this time, like for the 220 record, we had like a pre-production kind of setup. We actually had a studio where we had 2 rooms. In one room, we had a setup where the band could work together and play together with drums and everything in a studio situation. Let me put it like this. And then when we were done with a song and we had exactly a imagination and a vision of how it's supposed to sound, we just went drum-wise to the other studio where the old drum kit from Ingo was set up and ready to record. So we just, replugged it, and then we recorded these songs. This time we didn't want to do that. We were like, more of a let's lay down as many ideas as we can. So we have a pool of ideas. So for a lot of songs, we went in and recorded them once, twice. Then normally there's kind of this hierarchy thing when the songwriter, is the main guy. So when Kai writes a song, he hears it first. When we have recorded our stuff, we send it to him, and then we get his comments, and then everybody else chimes in and, thinks, maybe we should try that. Maybe we should try that. So, it was a very, very creative process, and we recorded a lot of songs because they had written quite a bit, like a lot of bands actually over pandemic, they couldn't go out and stuff. So they had written a really nice bunch of songs, which we knew that would work out. And we said, look, we're going to record as many as possible. And even if we don't finish them up, but then we have a nice collection of songs where you can pick the, most liked, best songs, whoever wants to make that decision. I like them all. And I'm always wrong. I go like, this song is shit. I should not be on the record. That's the, main song. So you can be very wrong there, with fans and stuff. But, that's just how that happened. And of course we did. This time I think we didn't go with a analog and a parallel a digital recording thing. We did that on the one before, on the 220 album. We recorded everything onto a tape machine as well as onto a computer. And it's a process that has its pros, like sound-wise, and, sounds old and like nice and round or whatever. But it hinders you on the creative side because you have to work different. For example, like for the 2020 album, we recorded the drums like we went for the verses, let's say. So we've recorded one verse, the verse again, the second verse again, second verse again, always parallel. Because that's the only way how to keep track. If you have that all floating around, you cannot handle it. So we had that process, and this time we wanted to approach it differently and more from the creative part. So we went for the full songs. We had we didn't want to do the separate things. It really creates a different feeling. This is actually on the MetalCon thing, which happens next week. That's what we're going to show. That's what I would like to, have young engineers to realize how much you can do in the performance just by creating different environments and different technical environments as well. So that's going to be quite interesting. I learned that actually from Mickey D. because he always records without click track. And, you have to work it's a different work. And I remember when I think 98 or when we recorded together the We Are Motorhead album, then, Lemmy would come in and say, can we play the song also one time with click track? And so I had a world-class drummer recording it without and with click track. And that makes you realize what click track and all this, we quantize and blah, blah, blah stuff is really doing to the music, and I've been through with a lot of, unfortunately, not a lot of metal drummers actually can do that because it's very hard to play, without click track, without getting slower, because it keeps you up. So you have to train for that. And actually Danny, even 15 years ago when we did it the first time, he was into it and he was saying, I'm gonna, it won't be all of the songs, but, most of the songs I can play to keep it up on speed. Because if you get tired playing like 10 minutes of double bass drum and stuff. So you have to train for that. And he did that and it just worked out really fantastic. But this time, like I said, we went more for I had him play in different vibes. We always did like one track in the end where I said, just go bananas. Because, of course, you go like, you play something and you go like, but watch out, there's like this vocal line coming in or there's this rhythm from some other instruments, because then, he turns it up and says, now I hear it, like the keyboards go like triplet and blah, blah, blah. So you cannot go, syncopated in the drums and stuff. So we are, very detailed on that. And this time we also went in and said, look, just forget everything. Just play, just to do something you might not even consider doing for a record. And that really worked out very nice. It was very, very, a very creative process. Even if we were so creative that like after 4 weeks, we started doing guitars because that was the plan. We do record drums. And then I start with Sasha recording drums in the same studio. And then like after 2 weeks or so, I went like, maybe we should record more songs because we had some songs left, to pick from. And I said, this, because normally you have that, you record something and you go like, that song didn't come out that great for drum wise, for like feeling wise, didn't have the energy because we recorded it late, whatever. So, but this time we really went back in again, because he was just in a very good mood and in a very good, power cycle for his playing. So we just played down as many tracks as we could. And that was, really fun.
How was the bass recorded for Giants and Monsters album?
The bass, I have to, you of course, I wasn't alone. He said like I said, the same thing with Roy Z. I did a couple of times in productions, but the last time, the Giants and Monsters was with Dennis Ward, and of course, Dennis is a fantastic musician and a bass player himself. So, we decided to, take the whip and, I'm a drummer, like I studied drums at some point. So I'm naturally good with drums and him being a, great, bass player, naturally being very good with ideas for bass. So he actually recorded all the bass with, Marcus in Hamburg. In a small studio and, and we did it the other way around. Then me and, Danny and everybody else was just sitting there hearing it going, maybe we should do this. Maybe we should try that. We just were like bouncing around ideas, but he recorded everything in Hamburg with Marcus. So I was not involved in the bass recording. That was like, we've done that a couple of times for some productions, also with Gotthard, for example, where Dennis would come in. I just believe that's what the Americans are really good in. They're giving the jobs to specialized people. In Germany, it's like, if you want to be a producer, you have to wipe the floors, sing, dance, do everything, And in America, it's like if they want to have a string arrangement, it's not like that anymore because the money has also, gone down. But in the 80s, 90s, if you wanted to have strings, then, you hire the best string arranger your money can buy. And the best orchestra and the best blah, 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 and that's, like I say, that's what I believe in. If you want to have something special, get special people that have a special talent for, working with certain things. I mean, I'm good with melodies. I'm really good with recording vocals and drums. With guitars, I'm very good in the regard to, coming up with, or getting people to give the best. The same with vocals. But, I'm not the guy who can actually take a guitar because I'm not a guitarist, but if you have a producer or someone who is a great guitarist like Roy at that time, he would take over. But it's always like a give and take, it's like once you tell someone what to do, you have to be very careful not to step on what he wants to do, what his ideas are. So you have to be very careful on that side. So yeah, I'm good at that. And bass, all the credit goes to Dennis, and he did a fantastic job. I mean, I really, really like what he's done with Marcus.
How were guitars recorded for Giants and Monsters album?
This was also like we did it also for the 2020 album. I normally always record with Waiki. That's like the main thing. I recorded with Sasha as well for Giants and Monsters. We started, but as we decided to go back to record some more drums because we had a good, swing, as I told you, we could not finish the guitars. So Sasha also came down because then we went all down to Tenerife and we were working there. And Kai has his own studio in Slovakia, where he lives with his wife and his kids and stuff. So Dennis actually went to Kai to work there, and I worked with Sasha there, and the same thing. Then we bounced around our ideas, and everybody went like, no, this has to be like this, whatever discussions. And I was when I got down to Tenerife, I was doing the work with Waiki. And then, but Kai then, decided, he also wants to be part. That was like the main thing that I think feels so great about this album is that they started to get really interested in each other's songs and stuff, because all of a sudden we had even Danny, he had some private things going on but he even came down. He said, I want to be part of this. And it was more like in the young days when we were all kids. You remember the bands, it was like everybody was sitting there watching the drummer. What's he gonna do? Now the guitarist is doing it. And that, of course, with being spread out that far, one in Spain, one in Slovakia, one in Germany, Hamburg, or wherever, it's hard to do that because on a high scale, like that, you cannot have them for 3-4 months in one studio. They would kill each other. Not really, but that's not a good idea. Let me put it like this. So we had split it up, but in the end, we were all on Tenerife. Kai came down, with his girlfriend. He also went, have some holidays, but then I recorded guitars with him. And Waiki was of course there, and I think even Marcus came down, but he came down for eating fish. He's a huge fishing guy. He goes on he has actually what they call a trawler license, so he can go on big fishing things, and I think in Germany you need for everything you need a license. I'm not sure how it is in Russia, but Germans are kind of you need a license to do that. So yeah, he's totally into that, and there's of course a lot of fish down there. So that's what Marcus likes to do when he doesn't play, and if he doesn't is working. He very often, when I try to call him, it was, oh, no, he's on the trawler. You can't reach him. Then he goes out with some friends and does some fishing, and then he comes back and, continues working and stuff. So, yeah, but this was really the big thing this time, that everybody then, came down. And of course, it's, you have to be careful, like to, who's saying what, these bands, like Helloween and also like some of the other bands I work, live of the strong characters, of the different characters of the people that work together. I strongly believe that, if everything works smoothly, let me put it like this, if everything is, oh no, this is nice. Yeah, what you've done there is great. It doesn't bring out the best. Sometimes you have to tell someone, this is shite. Like, even myself, I go like, nah, we cannot do it like this. So this is really one of the things. But of course, then you have to be careful, with having, because of course, like Michael and also like Andi, they are used to work just with the, producer or the engineer. Dennis did work with Andi. I worked with Michael, blah, blah, blah. And then, Dennis did some stuff with Michael and I did some stuff with Andi. So it just bounces around, but it's always one person. If you do vocals, it's not a good idea to have a whole band in there. Yeah. You can feel it when you start working. It's a very, how can I put this? You need to be fast. You have to react. You have to feel very fast what's right and what is wrong. You cannot, sit there and go, I'm not sure and maybe and blah, blah, blah. You have to go, hey, oh, this was great, but let's try it a little bit into this direction. Let's do that. And that just creates a very focused kind of relationship. And then if the door swings open, because we had that happening, of course, then like the songwriter of the song walks in, and he just sits down, and out of the corner, like Andi or Michael can see, and they go like, it changes, it's not bad. It's not that they don't want that, but you can feel that it changes. So it's for me, it's always much nicer just having one person at a time in the studio and get a good working relationship going there.
How were Andi Deris, Michael Kiske and Kai Hansen's vocals recorded for Giants and Monsters?
Yeah, I mean, that's, we basically talked already a little bit about it. It was also because of the workload. When I go down and work with Waiki on guitars, then, that might take like 2 weeks, 10 days, whatever it takes. But, then, you also have Michael sitting there and wanting to sing, and Andi is there. So, once we have had some songs ready, we started recording them, and, Dennis did a lot of work with Andi. He did the main stuff with Andi, and, I did the main recordings with Michael, because that's what he wanted. We just sit down and we go like, how do you want to work? And it's very important. Andi is more like this workhorse. He walks in and, he smokes a lot of cigars. And, with some cigar and red wine, and then, he's this very, how can I say, a powerful guy. He wants to, let's do it. When Michael is more like, he has to be in the mood. With him, it's really, really delicate. I mean, to be honest, sometimes we talk like for 2 hours and then record for 1. Because it's for him, it's just important to have this great vibe in the room to really perform some great stuff. And this time I was really happy, and him too. I mean, we were like really coming up with some great, singing lines. And because also this time, in the record before, we had the problem a little bit that we had to, we didn't know how to incorporate the 3 singers into one record without, having this too much, this not enough. So we took a long time to decide who is singing what and stuff. So, by figuring out who's singing what, we kind of lost a little bit of the, how can I put this? Not the track, but we were so sure, this part is great for Michael, so have him sing it, on the 2020 album. This time we sat down and we said, look, we're going to take all the time and we have them sing both. So, Andy has sung a song, then Michael has sung a song. And, he might have come and said, this song is not for me. I don't like it. I don't feel right for the song. Then we would not do that. But in general, everybody was doing it. And then Kai came in. He said, no, I'm going to sing that part. And I have an idea for that. And then, Sasha is also a good singer, even though it's not the real metal voice, but like live is great. And also in the studio for some of the stuff, it was for us crystal clear to say, let Sasha do that part. And then, Kai would come in and go like, yeah, but maybe that idea is better. And then we just piled up ideas, and it was like, it was really fun, and of course, then you have the discussions. No, I like this better. No, I like this better. And sometimes you have to say, kids, out. Now we decide, me and Dennis, very often sat down and, we're talking about results and stuff without the band. So we were like going like, yeah, but maybe that song, Michael should try as well. And this part, so it just grew. It's not so, where, for the 2020 album, it was more like, we were, how can I put this? It was more like planning and then working. For this time, it was more working and letting it grow. And if it takes us somewhere else, let's go all the way till we have it, really done well, really recorded well, and then step back and look at it. And that was a big difference this time. I think you can hear that in the.
What is your approach on mixing drums for Helloween, like in general?
In general, it's a, how can I put this? It's a very busy music. Let me put it like this. There's a lot of stuff going on. So it's always hard. It's when you start out working with that kind of music, it's very often it happens that you have, the drums are too loud. The guitars are not dominant enough. And the guitars and vocals are the main important parts in that kind of music. So in most of the songs, you have to, sneak in the drums. Let me put it like this. But what helps a lot with their stuff, it's like the studio we recorded is like a really huge room. And it has some very nice natural ambience. And it adds to the depth. And when you get the depth and the surrounding of the drums right, you can get away with much more featuring the guitars without losing the drums. It's always, I'm more like this old stuff. I mean, no offense, but like if I listen to a Priest Painkiller, that drum sound kicks me. That's something that, this roomy, it's just, really impressive and really kicks my heart. Nowadays, for me, the new stuff they do is a little bit too clinical. It doesn't have the taste to it, the vibe. So I would always go for more like the Painkiller, the 90s kind of drum sound. And of course, that's what we also try to do with Helloween. To create that kind of vibe that was around late 80s, 90s for stuff. I don't think it's the right band. It's the same like with Saxon. There are bands that stand for something, and of course, Judas Priest does that as well. Don't get me wrong, but they stand for a certain vibe. And it would not make any sense to have them sound like Rammstein or that kind of stuff. It just doesn't fit. So it can be like for a part where you go like now we really want to have this Rammsteinish vibe, for example. But, in general, not, you want to have the very natural. I think we didn't use a hell of a lot we didn't use any actually, samples or anything. I know that I got approached by people that were telling me, they don't like the tom sound, not on this album, but on I think in 2013 or whenever on one of the Helloween albums. And, they were saying, I don't like the samples on it. And I go like, I never put samples on toms. Sometimes, we did it on bass drum and snare for having the rooms, because if you have a small room, you have to add some depth to it. So we use samples for room sounds, but never on toms. And I'm like, what do you mean? I don't use any samples on toms. I would really never do that. That's just a beauty for me. It needs to sound powerful and at the same time, it needs to have a quality sound. Like when you listen even to the old stuff with Ingo, it has something that you need to have for Helloween, and so it's very important for me to keep it as natural as possible and as little technical as necessary. Sometimes, of course, when it goes really fast, all these blast beat drummers, how can you, how can you get power into that? And, Danny is really, really good in getting power in fast drumming. That's really one of his things. If you watch him live, you even can see it. And a lot of drummers, when they have to play that kind of speed, get very technical, very light. They don't really, you have to lean in, and that's it. We had that actually when we recorded the drums. We took a lot of time, when we had breaks and food breaks and stuff, and we're watching other drummers to how they lean into and, how they really kick it. And, you have to give it to Metallica. Lars Ulrich, people go, he's not a good drummer. Hey, he's a fantastic drummer. To really have this stamina and to really give every beat a meaning, he's a fantastic fucking drummer. He might not be the fastest, but who cares? If you hear a riff and his playing, and that's what we were after also, like, with Danny this time. We were really leaning in and really trying to give everything a meaning. And I hope we didn't destroy it in the mix.
So what is your approach on mix and bass for Helloween? What is your approach on taming low and for bass when you are mixing for Helloween in general?
In general, it's like it's a hard part because it's a lot of information falls onto the same spots. You have the bass drum, snare, bass, of course, like the guitars, you can get away with putting them left and right. So you have the bass in the center. But yeah, it's always like like if I have doof, tack, I'm missing out on the tack. I don't have a lot of low end. On the little, you have a constant in the low end going on. So you have to have a nice mid range around 1K. It needs to be grippy and to have a mid range like a guitar. So it adds into the guitars, but it also needs like the sizzle on top. And the low end, you really have to, we normally split it. We run in one channel, we just run the low end below 100, 120 hertz, whatever, and tame that different with different compression than we do for the mid range and the upper range. And then that gets, sit in. So, because it's Marcus is like, I think he's one of the most underrated bass players out there because he plays a lot of things. If you don't hear them, it's pointless, if you know what I mean. He needs to be heard because he has all these little ideas. That's what he always had. That's his style of, having, little melodies here and there where you go like, you need to be able to hear them. And yes, it's a very hard job to get that working in all the, thunder thunderous signals that you have around. And of course, it's always the fight who gets the low end. I mean, bass drums, it's okay, but with the guitars, you can imagine guitarists go like, nah, that's me. That's my range of frequencies. And then, the bass player goes, yeah, but I want to be heard there as well. And it's sometimes, there are bands. I mean, this is like one of the things where you go like, is there even a bass player in Judas Priest? I mean, on some of the records, it's like very, it's giving it all to the guitars and, just very little to the bass. That's how I hear it, and other bands have it where you go like, the band has to have the same space or the same importance in the mix than the guitars. So anything works. And then, of course, you have like, where the bass player takes a lot of leading and a lot of productional work as well, like with Steve Harris, in Maiden. And of course, then, it becomes another beast. So or Manowar, the same thing, it's once the, and it is all important, but you cannot lose the power. You need the power of the guitars. So it's really hard to tame him in, but he has a very, very good tone. This is like, with every instrument, it's actually how you play it. If you hit a tom right, it's not going to go going, going. It goes, it gets if you have the punch right. The same with the bass. If you watch, have you ever met Marcus for an interview or anything in Russia? Maybe no. But if you would, it's like his hands, he's a very flashy. I mean, he's a learned bass player. I hate guitar players trying to play bass, I have to say, because they're always like, it's like, Marcus is like a fucking monster, he has this, he has a lot of tattoos. Okay. And Roy, he compared him with, the Moby Dick story about the white whale, Moby Dick. There's a guy in there called Quick from one of the, Asian, whatever, insulas there. And, he's also like completely tattooed. So Roy always called him Quick. Quick, come in here. We have to play some bass.
What is your approach on mixing guitars for Helloween? And in this case, how do you create guitars to make them sound big? And how do you work on the frequencies to get some room for drums and bass between guitars in this case?
It's the same thing with guitars. You have to spread them out. And nowadays you have some really nice technical possibilities to make them sound even coming further away from the speakers than, the speakers are. But that actually started in the 90s. I was telling Sakis the other day, we were talking shortly about it. Do you know the Slave to the Grind Skid Row? This was like one of the albums where we were sitting there and going, I have no clue how we did that, because the guitars, they were the speakers and the guitars were like, whoop, they came even from further left and right. And at that time that it was a very high, very expensive and also like a high, how can I put this, highly technical thing. We've at some point, because Michael Wagner did it. So at some point we were talking to Michael and, he told us what he did. And he used like a limiter, actually like a radio limiter, which was called the Dominator from I think it was AKG, it was Aphex. I think Aphex, I'm not 100% sure now, but I think it was Aphex and it was called the Dominator. And it was the Dominator 2, which had like all the knobs right to actually put them on guitars. So a lot of, you can either get the distortion from the amp, what a lot of people do. It's so, they're so overdriven. Mikey, for example, he likes to have a not so distorted sound. He wants to record with sometimes it's even like, he's having a hard time to making it sing and sustain the guitar tone. But then later on, when you squeeze it and you put some limiting on, you get the overtone structure of the guitar gets squeezed into the signal. And that makes it sound very grippy and very, very big. That gives you a much bigger sound, as if you already, give too much gain and too much distortion on the way in. Now, Kai, at the other hand, he uses a lot of pedals and a lot of EQing before he hits the amp to get his tone. So they have their own sound. And Sasha he's again different. He uses, maybe like in between. He's not as non-distorted as Waiki, and it's not as distorted as Kai. So we actually have a natural, nice balance in between the characters, and you cannot do that when they all play the same amps. This is one of the things. It's when you can get away with recording rhythm guitars left and right with the same sound. But you cannot then add the same tone, the same amp settings, even if you just distort it more. You never use the same amp for solo. You need to have a different character in the distortion. So a lot of people use then different amps like a Soldano or amps that give a more creamy kind of sound when they play their lead stuff. That helps. And of course, I've learned that at the Running Wild at Black Hand Inn, because most people go left, right. Some people go left, right, and double left, right. Okay, so you have 4 guitars. Black Hand Inn, quadruple, 4 guitars on each side. And when you do that, you record one guitar as it, then it has the right feeling, the rhythm guitar, and then you just double to this one guitar. Never start doubling to the other guitars as well. Don't hear them. Then you record them, switch them off. So that's what we had partly. We had double tracked all the guitars on each side because we have 3 guitarists. So it's Sasha double tracked, Waiki double tracked, and Kai double tracked. But I have to admit, in the mixing process, sometimes it gets too wobbly. It happened to other bands as well. If you go into, listen to some old Judas Priest stuff, you will find some stuff where it kind of gets chorusy, because how do you hit it and all the tuning stuff is very vital. So you end up with some, not so clear sounds. So in the end, with some songs, we actually dropped some of the guitars that we had recorded. And we just used one left and right, but also left sometimes one just Sasha doubled himself on one side. And then in the next part, Kai comes back in. So it's like you have to come up with a nice arrangement. You can even go so far with like Def Leppard, when they do guitar arrangements, they even break up the parts of one guitar into separate guitars, and that kind of stuff you have a little bit in the, twin solo department. You cannot have like 3 rhythm guitars and 3 solo guitars, playing, with all the 16th notes. Even if it's them, it's just going to be too much. So you have to, thin out and on the right spots to make it, cut through and be dominant and be nice.
What is your approach on mixing vocals for Helloween? Again, there are 3 different vocalists, and how do you manage their vocals in a mixing session?
It's basically a similar situation. They have different voices, and of course, mostly like on the records, we have just Michael sing one part, and then Andy sing one part, and then maybe Kai. Or sometimes double track, but mostly it's like separated. And what's hard and what's always causes discussions is naturally when Andy sings, he has like a more blurring voice. He puts a lot of compression in the voice itself, so it's and that makes him cut through. quite nice, even through the guitars. That's actually one of the main things you have to work on when you want to do vocals. A lot of people, don't understand that you have to fight fire with fire. So you have to add distortion actually to the vocals. And you can do that very easily in the box. Anyways, in a DAW with like Pro Tools or Logic, it doesn't matter. You take something like lo-fi, and you create certain distortion along with the voice, and that evens it in, and that gives it a nice solidness in the distortion department. Because very often in metal you have to when they really power, like the voice kind of, it crackles more than it should. So you can actually do that. Now with Michael, who has a totally different singing technique and is not so much into blurring, he was this time much more. It was really interesting because on the 2020 album, he was like not holding back is the wrong thing, but he didn't want to get into the metal kind of singing. This time he was quite open. He was really, if it fits the mood and the song, that he was giving more than he was doing before in metal. So it's like it was really interesting. And of course, he's a huge Elvis fan, as everybody knows when live when you start singing some Elvis stuff, and and that's like. He wants to have this looseness in it when he gives power. He doesn't want to have the strained power. That's his thing. So, and then you have a little bit of the problem mixing wise that he doesn't cut through as good as someone that is really, very peaky. I mean, a very peaky voice is Ralf Repa's Primal Fear, who, recorded it back then with Gamma Ray. In the Insanity and Genius, and he's like, we have this joke because back then we always used the same background singer people. Okay, we knew each other, so you called Ralph and you called Friedel and you called Fernando from Victoria, whoever, and they came in and they sang background vocals, and with Ralph it was always like a very peaky voice. He would always stick out. And then you start, okay, it was great, but can you please step back? So you have like 4 singers singing into one microphone. Can you please step back a little bit? Can you please step back a little bit? And one time someone said, can you please open the door, go out and close the door and sing out there? And so if you don't have this peakiness in the voice, you have to somehow work hard to get him cut through. The same is nice. So when they switch back and forth, they need to have the same presence. When Michael takes over from Andi, it cannot drop. It cannot feel weird. It needs to be up there, and that's a little bit technical work more than in the singing department, because you cannot get Michael to sing as Andi, and the other way around. Andi has a nice technique when he, of course, on tour you cannot sing 3 hours straight through, giving full power every day. So they all get a certain technique, that makes it sound good, and but it's not full power. It's not straining the voice so much. So, but Michael, he's the master. I've seen so many people, and there's like records out where a lot of people try to sound like Michael, and then Michael walks in and shows them how it goes. That's unfortunately, that's what it is. He has this very brilliant technique, and he just, has this full body thing, and no matter who tries to sing like him, I have not found anybody who can, where I would say it imitates it, but it's not there. It's not there. When Michael walks on, it's Michael. That's
How do you prepare your mixes for mastering?
Yeah, this is a very good question, and it's well, what I do, and this is just in the 90s. I very early, I had the feeling that during mastering, things are happening that I didn't like. Okay, you do a mix, and then it has a certain vibe. And I believe in when then someone touches it, and which is very good. You just have to find the right person. It's very hard to find a good mastering engineer who actually adds to your way of working. It's not so much being good or being bad or doing a good mix and a bad mix. That's all bullshit. A good mastering engineer takes your mix and embellishes it or pushes forward the good things. And, maybe if there's some, not so good things in there, then he covers it up. You have to find someone who really does that for your, who really fits your way of working. And I had this very early on because I started very early with Pro Tools, in 94, that I didn't have that. We all went to, and sometimes we even had to go to mastering studios that were mostly doing classic. So you walked in there and had this B&W, nice classic speakers, and I didn't even recognize my stuff. Then I found a lot of stuff I did in Hamburg at Chateau du Pape with one of the big studios, like 3 facility studios, where actually Helloween recorded a lot of stuff, and I met the guys there and stuff. But they had the main engineer, the technical engineer for the studios, who was fixing all the board. He was doing mastering, and he was fantastic. it was the first time that I had the feeling someone actually understood the music I was bringing in. But he really was there's only a few people that worked, and I know so many people. They even flew out to LA and New York and tried to get people to master. And it sometimes it doesn't work. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't matter if Bob Ludwig or Bernie Grundman, these big names, touch your stuff or not. So I started very early to actually mix into a final chain. My mastering chain has partly like 5, 6, 8, 10 plugins, like, compressors, shaping certain things. I never use one plugin or a few plugins to do a lot. I use a lot of plugins to do very little. That's my thing. I know that people go like, no, you cannot do it like this. I just have that. So for me, and what you have to think about is when you work with someone, they want to hear it and they want to compare it to a finished CD or so a finished record. So you cannot give them a raw mix. Like in the beginning on the analog boards, you just gave them a rough mix. And then they go like, yeah, but this doesn't sound like this or this. No, and I wanted to have my drums sound like that and blah, blah, blah. And you go like, yeah, it's not mixed yet. You cannot, it's not mastered. We have to, the compressor is going to do that. The reverb's going to come up, the echoes, everything. And how often were we sitting in mastering and had to get rid of some limitation because like the reverbs and all the effects just were too loud because they come up when you squeeze the picture. So I very early started to not having anybody touch my mixes. I think even in the 90s, from 96 on, I was doing always my own mastering chain. And I always, of course, now with record companies, you cannot say, well, this is it and blah, 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 because they always believe they can do it better. Okay. So, which is fine. So I always do a runoff without my chain. I take out everything that would someone else hinder of doing a great mastering job. I had that with Angel's Cry, like the Angra record. When it first came out, it was only coming out in Japan. And the Japanese engineers are really, really good. So very technically, but very precise and stuff. And they did a great job. And when they released it actually in Europe or in Germany, they took the finished master, and I didn't know because I was telling everybody in the chain, look, when you get it prepared for Germany, tell me, and I give him a limited master. So he can actually, do the same thing as whatever he wants, but he has the chance to do something good to the master in the mastering process. And, but they used the finished master from the Japanese and then re-EQ'd it and, limited it again. And it sounded horrible. So, we had to redo it then. And once I knew that they were working on it, I said, why didn't you call me? I just sent you a non-limited version. And that's what I kept doing up till now. So when you work with me, you get my finished idea. That's how it's supposed to sound. And then I take off my mastering chain. And then we had like when Ronald Brent mixed the 2020 album from Helloween, he was like, his wife is Darcy Proper, and she is a Grammy. I mean, she's, untouchable. She knows what she's doing. Great mastering engineer. But somehow it did not happen. It was like Ronald was mixing and she was mastering it, and we liked the mixes better than with the mastering. For some reason, it did not work, and we were like really, and then I was trying, and Dennis, and because he also does mastering, so we were all doing something to it, and then in the end, I remembered I met a guy, the guy that actually mastered the last two records is from Berlin, and he's like, his name is Busy, because he's very busy, always, because he does everything that gets released in Germany, and he's a very talented and very open. He comes out of the, like a dance floor kind of stuff, like the street kind of rough dance stuff. He does a lot, and he does everything that gets released in Germany, and all the pop stuff. And, I called him up and I asked him, like, do you want to give it a try? Because I didn't even know that he would do stuff like that. I met him at a, party in Berlin, and he said, yeah, of course. And I sent it to him, and, he just sent it one song back, and I just hit play, and I listened to it, and I hit stop, and I sent it out to the management, to bottom row, and it just wrote, this is it. Because it was perfect. He added something to what we had. So, he was doing the last two records, and it's of course, sometimes it's hard when they go back and they remove certain plugins or certain stuff that I use and use their own stuff. They turn it into something that you don't want to have, and then you have to, get them back to on track. So, it's trial and error for everybody. I mean, I know big records that were mixed 10 times and that were mastered 10 times. It's just a normal process. Because sometimes, people just have great ideas on the spot. They hear it and they go, I try that. And that's what you want to have. You want to end up with something special. So it's always the hard thing. But that's what I do. I just mix into my mastering chain from a very early stage on. I'm not like the guy who mixes and then switches it on in the last 2 hours. The first beat goes into the full chain. That's how I do it.
Thank you so much for such a wonderful interview and for such a knowledgeable conversation. It was a huge honor talking to you, and thank you so much for all of your wonderful audio work, especially that you are doing for Helloween, because again, I'm a huge fan of Helloween and have been listening to them for almost 30 years already. And each album sounds better and better thanks to your wonderful help. And thank you so much for sharing your experience and knowledge on sound engineering. It was a super duper knowledgeable and super duper interesting talking to you. Thank you so much for everything.
Thank you for having me. That was my pleasure.